The RTX 3070, 3070 Ti, and 3080 are all powerful GPUs. But what is the one problem they all have in common? Well, they all have less memory than their AMD counterparts, but why? There were so many people back in 2020 saying that this might not be a problem yet, but it will be the part to fail first. We all know that there's a planned date of obsolescence with every piece of technology. Your graphics card isn't going to be amazing forever. However, capping your VRAM, when NVIDIA doesn't put enough VRAM in their graphics card, that particularly feels really bad to the consumer, because you know your GPU core has enough clock speed, enough power going to it, it's capable of running more, but it's capped by its VRAM when they could just put more VRAM in their card. You as a consumer don't have any way of controlling how much VRAM is in it. What NVIDIA gives you is what they give you. It is like having a ticking time bomb in your graphics card. We know that NVIDIA intentionally capped their VRAM because AMD was more than happy to put more VRAM in their competing graphics cards, which shows that this was affordable for NVIDIA to do as well, but they didn't. There is an argument to be made that NVIDIA's engineering of Ampere didn't have enough cache, so they went with less but faster VRAM opposed to RDNA 2, which had more cache, so they were able to have more VRAM, but it was slightly slower. However, we shouldn't be making excuses for NVIDIA to limit the amount of VRAM here, because we look to the future and they doubled down when they released the RTX 3080 12GB in January of 2022. That was 16 months after the original 3080, with the amount of memory that it always should have had, 12GB. It primarily existed to upsell you from the limitation that NVIDIA put on their own graphics card. This has been a very common thing with the history of NVIDIA. The worst offender was the GTX 1060 3GB model. That card had more than just a VRAM limitation though. It also shared the same name as the GTX 1060 6GB model. Despite sharing names, the 3GB model performed noticeably worse than the 6GB because it had a GPU die that was cut down and it had half the VRAM. Whether NVIDIA tells you or not, the average consumer bought the 3GB model, and they had to deal with this limitation eventually, but they might have bought into it like seeing that as a 1060, so it's good value. Eventually, it probably started to slow down a lot and the consumer might have felt the need to get a new graphics card. You can call this a scam, robbery, or capitalism, whatever, but no matter what you call it, a graphics card being throttled by its VRAM capacity always feels bad to the consumer, because you know that the clocks and the power that were given to this card are more than capable of driving more, but you can't change the memory. NVIDIA gives you what they give you, and you just have to deal with it. They intentionally barely put enough VRAM in their graphics cards at the time to get by. And you can look at the RTX 3070 for this. It is pushing over 7GB of its available 8GB back in 2020. Within 4 years of its launch, it is going to be pretty common for 3070s to be hitting their memory limits, while AMD GPUs are probably going to still be chilling. Yes, you can tune settings in a game with hopes to lower its VRAM usage, but that instantly proves that not having enough VRAM from the start, or enough memory from the start, was the problem. Most hilarious thing was the RTX 3060. Most of you guys watching this video probably thought about this. The RTX 3060 had 12GB of VRAM, which was more than the 10GB 3080, which costed double. Yes, the 3060 did have GDDR6 memory with a smaller bus, while the 3080 had GDDR6X memory with a larger bus. But it didn't change the fact that the 3060 had more. And this is weird to the consumer because you would expect if you pay more to get a 3080, then you would get more. But this isn't always the case in the eyes of a big corporation. You see, the 3060 released back in January of 2021. That was when GPU mining was really starting to soar in popularity, and mining is very memory intensive. So the 3060 actually fell into place as one of the best value mining cards. The big corporation wants to make money. That's all I can say. Although, coming out of this mining craze, consumers actually got a GPU from Nvidia that had an excess of VRAM. And thank God that if you own a 3060, you don't have to constantly watch your memory to make sure you're not going over and bottlenecking your card. It's funny that consumers finally didn't get ripped off, but this graphics card wasn't really for the mainstream consumer, no matter what Nvidia wants to try to tell you. Well, if Nvidia tries to trap us into buying new graphics cards with artificial VRAM timers built into them, why doesn't AMD do the same thing? Because they do position their competing graphics cards with more memory than their Nvidia counterparts. But the answer to this, in my opinion, is quite simple. AMD has to do something for consumers to look at and consider buying their cards over Nvidia. After all, Nvidia comfortably sits at 75% of market share for gamers, and this includes all of the integrated graphics from Intel and AMD. Weighing the pros and cons of buying into each company, consumers have to balance that there is an option on the market that has more VRAM than Nvidia. And when looking at the spec sheet, seeing a bigger number is very good marketing for AMD, and I can respect that. As long as they keep their drivers updated, their cards will have more longevity, technically speaking, than Nvidia. As games gradually require more VRAM in the future, RDNA will age like fine wine, as AMD has said many times.
Correctly predicting into the future that 16 gigabytes of VRAM is the thing that is needed for future games, then if they make that bet and it turns out true, then you're going to see that fine wine situation versus a card that didn't make that bet.
But for most consumers, this sadly doesn't matter. If their GPU lasts 4 years before it has a significant fall off, that's pretty good. And that's how Nvidia positions these cards, and they're a very smart company. They aim for them to hit their limits when average people are considering an upgrade anyway. Then you get hooked back in. Nvidia is also very aware of their majority position in the market. They can put barely enough memory in their graphics cards, knowing that game developers have to account for it, because if they don't, a lot of people just aren't going to play their games. They're not going to be able to. Devs have to optimize for the majority most of the time. It's kind of depressing to think of how your tech is just going to be obsolete in a few years and there's nothing you can really do about it. It's not like system RAM where you can just buy more and stick it in your motherboard. You can't upgrade your VRAM. So Nvidia forces you to spend more upfront to future-proof your graphics card, or you just have to be ready to make an upgrade in a few years. Kind of like a closed ecosystem, not very different from Apple slowing down the older iPhones through software updates to slowly get you to buy their new phones. This is just the style of marketing that works. And unless AMD or Intel is really able to step it up with their competition, Nvidia will continue to have a stranglehold on the market as a whole. But it is what it is, and give this idea some thought, and I'll see you guys in the comment section. Peace.